Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our Win in Drought live discussion. This is part 2 of our Win in Drought series, and we appreciate you tuning in tonight. We are live on both Facebook and YouTube. We did have some technical difficulties, so I apologize for the delayed start, but we are happy to dive into this conversation on educational and regulatory solutions to improve spring flows. So before we begin with our wonderful guest today, just a few housekeeping notes. We will be answering questions live from viewers. So if you're on Facebook and YouTube, you can go ahead and participate in the conversation, drop your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer some of them at the end of the discussion if time permits. And we do have some other educational YouTube and videos you can watch as part of this series, and for some background on spring flows. So starting with our Springs Advocacy 101 series, this is a series we did last summer to give the basics on the policies and programs to kind of get an intro into a Springs advocacy. If this is new to you, if you've just joined the Florida Springs Council, or if you still want to freshen up on some of that Springs advocacy. So we definitely recommend watching Why is Flow Declining in Florida Springs for some background. We define a lot of the terms that we'll probably be discussing today. And then you can tune into part 1 of this specific series if you missed the first part. It was a wonderful conversation with some wildlife experts and biologists talking about the impact of low flows on threatened species, specifically manatees and Gulf sturgeon. But today we are going to talk about some solutions to improve spring flows. Now that we've talked about the impacts, we'll get into some of the solutions. And we are happy to have Stacy Greco from Alachua County with us today. Stacy is the Water Resources Manager for the Alachua County Environmental Protection Department. So thank you for joining us, Stacy, and I'm going to let you take it away and dive into the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and to be able to talk to everybody about something that I'm very passionate about. So I always like to start with the big picture. Everyone recognizes the state of Florida here. All of these blue areas, these are water resource caution areas. So these are places where we have or we're projected to have critical water supply issues within the next 20 years. So it's almost the whole state, and it's 80% of the population. So this is really a statewide problem that we're talking about. And really, we're going to focus in on this area here, which is the North Florida Regional Water Supply Planning Boundary. So much of North Florida. The green is in the St. Johns River Water Management District. The yellow is in Sewanee. I work for Alachua County there at the bottom, and we are divided into both water management district, which makes my life extra fun. So within that area, the water supply plan was just updated at the end of 2023. And looking at the 20-year planning horizon, population is projected to increase by 49%. So to have that 1 million more people move to this region, it identified that we would need 135 million gallons a day more water for that. And remember from past webinars that we're already not meeting our minimum flows and levels for the Santa Fe and Ichetucknee. So we already don't have enough water to have our healthy springs and rivers with our current use. And now we're having to accommodate this future growth. So the plan also identified potential ways to find that water, with projects making up the bulk of it. And so really expensive at over $2 billion. So this includes projects like, things like the North Florida Water First project. And it also identified conservation. And the real take home to me is the return on investment here. Water conservation is much more cost effective. So if you're fiscally constrained, like governments are, then it makes more sense. For every 3.4 million that you spend, you can save 1 million gallons a day rather than, the more expensive projects. And how that works is if we can do meaningful water conservation, we can accommodate this 1 million people with less water. Maybe we don't need 135. Maybe we can do it for 60 million gallons. And then you don't need the expensive projects to try to develop that water. So I will be kind of focusing on what is that water conservation? What can we do? But before we get into that, it's really important to understand where is the water coming from. So this is a pie chart that is looking at the Suwannee River Water Management District, the MFL. So this is looking at the Itchitucknee River. So what withdrawals are influencing that river? So the big orange piece of the pie, that is agriculture. In some areas, that piece would be much bigger, but here in the Itchitucknee, it's about 33%. Local government, we can't touch agriculture because of the Right to Farm Act. So I really focus on, what do I have an influence on? And that is this highlighted yellow area. And this is basically our residential. So it's public supply, which is the blue. So that's all the water that we purchase from a utility like GRU, High Springs, Newberry. And then the bright pink, that's domestic self-supply. So those are wells at people's houses. And that public supply, while it does include things like restaurants, it's largely that residential use, which this is good because we can have an influence on this residential use. And if we zoom in and look at, how is residential water use? How are residents using that water? If they have an irrigation system, over 50% of that water is used outside. So, that's a great place for us to focus. And that's where a lot of our efforts at the county are. And to put it in perspective, because indoor water conservation is also important, and a lot of the building laws, those are really getting us some gains in indoor water conservation. But this is an IFAS graphic here that every time you turn on the average irrigation system, it uses about 1,000 gallons of water. And that's equivalent to an 8-hour shower or doing 37 loads of laundry. So that really shows you that inequity, that if we can get people to skip just one irrigation cycle, it saves a lot of water. And when we look at water use data, we see irrigation systems that are using 2,000 and even more. So I think this is a conservative estimate. So before I dive into what we're doing in Alachua County, we're going to play one of my favorite games that's called Irrigated or Not. Okay, so this is a yard here, and I think Chloe's going to put in the chat, you might be able to, yep, you can vote whether you think this is irrigated or not. So we see, it does look bright green there on the side. There's some patchiness under the tree from shade. So you can let us know if you think it's irrigated or not. Yeah, so they're using almost 30,000 gallons of water a month. So definitely irrigating here, and trying to decouple some of our assumptions about irrigation and what it looks like, that, even if you're not winning the yard of the month, you can still be wasting a lot of water. What about this yard? Looks pretty neat. Has a variety of vegetation there. Looks really lush. This one actually is in the Tioga area. Yeah, so they're not irrigating. They're using about 3,500 gallons a month. So that's mostly their indoor use. So this is someone who probably taking care of their soil and just recognizes that they don't need irrigation to have that classically aesthetic yard. Let's do another one. So this one, do you think it's irrigating or not? They're doing a good job. They're leaving their leaves there. So that's really good for our pollinators. They're not having to mow, so that's not contributing to emissions. But they're actually still using a lot of water at 20,000 gallons. So might be watering things that don't need it, because that's what happens. Your irrigation just kind of turns on and people set it and forget it. All right, our last one, and this one's a tricky one. What do we think? So for this one, they got some solar panels, so they probably care about environmental issues. So their grass, look at how lush that is. And that's using 0 gallons a month. So, probably again, healthy soils, a species that is established, just doesn't really need the water. So I want to always be careful with our programs that grass isn't bad. Grass can be a wonderful ground cover and can be great. It's how we manage it. So are we putting a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, or are you putting a lot of water on it? But this house, unfortunately, was still using a lot of water. So they had micro irrigation on their shrubs and their trees, and it was still using a lot of water. I think we did a tune up here and probably got that down close to 0. Okay, well, thanks for playing. So in Alachua County, we do education, incentives, and regulations, and I'll go into all 3 of these in more detail. So right now on water conservation, we've got a couple billboards up. Maybe you've seen them. We'll be doing ads on WFT radio about the water shortage. We always do paid social media, press releases. We're doing a lot of direct communication right now with the irrigation professionals, homeowners associations, real estate agents, just making sure that all of those different sectors that really can impact what homeowners are doing, that we're reaching them. This is a picture. We just put up an ad at the Oaks Mall, and then hopefully we'll start working with the Main Street Daily News soon. So really trying lots of different avenues to get the word out. This is our winter watering campaign we started a couple years ago. Just as an example, we try to have our campaigns be pretty fun and cute. So this is playing on that very Florida thing of wearing socks with your flip-flops that I said I would never do, but I caught myself doing after living here for 20-something years. And we'll see if Chloe can play the video for us. Thank you. So we worked with Uppercase Inc. on that. So, just kind of a cute message to get people to realize that in North Florida that, while it doesn't snow, that our yards do slow down and we can save significant water. Okay, so incentives. We have our Level Up program. This has evolved over the years. We started out with different programs, but we now limit it to our high water users. We found with our other programs, we weren't saving water if we weren't targeting the high water users. But that's a double-edged sword because sometimes that's not the audience that wants to engage with us. We only have about 10% of the people that we invite that interact with us, and then even less of them move through the rebate program. But if they fix their irrigation, fix leaks, they can get up to $2,000 for residential, $8,000 for commercial. And we're also doing stuff with soil amendments in new construction. So really trying to take care of that soil health. Okay, regulatory. We actually do regulation at the local government level. Kind of our flagship is our irrigation design code that impacts all new landscape irrigation systems. So not agriculture, but yards and businesses. So 2012, we were in a drought. Post Springs had pretty much stopped flowing. Horrible pictures out there, a lot of attention to what was going on. I went to the county commission, gave a presentation of here's things we can do to reduce water use. Like I showed you today, irrigation is a good place to start. I got authorized to start drafting the code. Took me a couple of years, tons of stakeholder outreach. I think the 20th draft I finally got adopted. And we started to implement that. And it's a huge lift. It takes staff and it's a big change. The irrigation industry was previously unregulated, which is pretty crazy with as much water that gets used with irrigation. 2022, we evaluated the water use and we weren't saving as much water as we thought we could. So we did a major overhaul. And the main thing there is we now limit irrigation to 50% of the lot or the common area. Which means we have to get back to having unirrigated landscapes. Half of it is established with temporary and then try to use the right plants so that it doesn't need that life support of irrigation. We also have been really focusing on commercial systems. Unfortunately, a lot of these systems, someone that pays the bill might live in Wisconsin and has no idea that a $500 bill for this small store is insane. So they must register with the county and provide annual documentation. So I'm going to show a QR code later. If you ever see any leaks or irrigation issues around the county, please let us know. We also do implement irrigation restrictions. So when can people use those irrigation systems? That's set by the state. We just locally enforce them. We really think once a week year round could save a lot of water. Right now, with the water shortage, we are in once a week. So we are collecting data. I have not been getting a lot of calls, actually any calls that people's yards are dying. So it might be some good evidence that if once a week is working during this extreme drought, that maybe we can do that all the time. But this is a postcard that we'll leave if we see that there was an irrigation violation. And we can get into citations and things like that, but we're pretty successful with our education. Real quickly, I do want to mention our Homeowner Association Florida Friendly Landscaping Code. So this is to help homeowners that want to make these changes to their yard, but their HOA is being a barrier. And it gives us the authority that HOAs cannot prohibit the implementation of Florida Friendly. Homeowners still need to follow their rules. You can't just go do whatever you want. But if the HOA is not giving you a Florida Friendly option, then we can get involved. And we do a site visit. We work with our extension office. And for the most part, we just get compliance by doing that site visit and talking about the code. Some of these pictures here, this is from a neighborhood that had a lot of mature landscapes and shade. And we're asking people to cut down trees to create sunlight so that little eyebrow of turf could do better. This one, we actually went all the way to court on and we won. They had to pay us a fine. They had to pay their lawyers. And now we kind of have that precedent that cutting down trees just to create light for grass is not Florida friendly. So if you're having issues with your HOA, please reach out. We can help. Okay, so steps to water shortage declaration. So I've kind of been talking big picture and not the drought and water shortage because I wanted to make the point that this isn't just a problem that we're having right now and that once it rains, it solves the problem. We've over allocated, we have issues, and it's really just exasperated right now because we're not getting the rains. So the Water Management District staff, we've got some great staff there. They review the hydrologic conditions and they make recommendations to the governing boards. For the current drought, they've been watching it for a while, and the first advisory came out in January, and that was voluntary. And then I believe that the mandatory stuff started happening in about March, and as of May of 2026, St. John's declared a phase 3 extreme water shortage and Sewanee modified phase 2 with slight differences, but basically this is it. So the big thing is that irrigation is restricted to once a week. So typically we would be allowing twice a week this time of year, but now it's once a week. There's also limits for establishing irrigation. So now is not the time to be replacing plants that have died, and HOAs cannot require that replanting right now or extra watering for aesthetics. And the same thing, no pressure washing for aesthetic reasons. So, there are some regulatory things here in this water shortage. This is something we made, reminding people that it also applies to private wells because we were seeing chatter on social media that people didn't think it applied to them. And that's the QR code I told you about. So you can report any water issues to us. So what are potential next steps? Because we can't control the weather, but we can control our use. We can control pumping. So Water Management District staff could recommend a new water shortage order with stricter requirements. And this could include temporary reductions in consumptive use permit allowances. So those permits, they do have language in them that requires compliance with water shortages. So it's not like they'd have to go in and rewrite all of those permits. I don't know what the political appetite is for that, but that is an option. We should continue and increase and improve our outreach efforts. We really do need to collectively find a way to overcome this "it's not me" attitude. Whenever we're posting stuff on social media, I'm seeing a lot of people just point their fingers at other use like bottled water, agriculture. And while we do need those things to be reduced, we also need to do it ourselves. So this picture here, this is consumptive use permits in the lower Santa Fe Basin. We pulled this in July 2019. So it's a little out of date, but not hugely. And the different colors are the size of the permits. So the big permit is the purple one. Here it was 30 MGD, and that's GRU. Now their permit actually is increased. So that's all of us in the Gainesville area using water. So that largest permit, we can all have an impact on. The bottled water is one of these like light green ones, where if that went away, we might see a difference there, especially at that spring right there. But for the whole regional problem, we have all of these permits. So, we need to be reducing water, from all of them and from all of us that are contributing to these big public supply wells. And this map does not include domestic self-supply. So this isn't any of like the small wells that are in people's backyards. These are the permitted consumptive use permits in that basin. Okay, what else can we do? So I started out talking about that future growth is predicted to need 135 million gallons a day. Well, we could change our development trends that could greatly reduce that need for additional water resources. So prohibiting permanent landscape irrigation for new construction if we're not meeting our MFLs. That's something local government cannot do. We are preempted. So that would be something that would have to be in something like the MFL or at the state level. Utilities with their permits, so those permits I was just showing you, the bigger ones tend to be the utilities, have water conservation plans. And I think there's room to strengthen all of those, to accelerate conservation, and to require dedicated water conservation staff. Everything I've showed you today happens because I have water conservation staff. It takes staff to make these things happen. Limiting irrigation to 1 day a week year round. That could be another way to reduce current and future demand. Other water management districts have that in some of their local municipalities. We are preempted up here from doing that. It would also help with the confusion. People don't know how to deal with the controllers. So now this would take away having to change it when the clock changes. There was actually some good provisions in the July 2024 version of the MFL regulatory strategy for the Lower Santa Fe and the Ichetucknee. It was prohibiting landscape irrigation wells, and that's just extra wells. People have public supply water. They don't want to pay the bill. They sink a well. Would love to see a prohibition on wells come back. And there was actually language to require offsetting of existing permits. That is not what got adopted, but that language has been drafted, so it's out there and perhaps could be restored in some future version. A water reservation may be another tool to ensure protections. I'm not sure that gets at existing permits, but might help with future permits. And then again, just revisiting that CUP process and the interpretation of the public interest. Is it in the public interest, for everybody to be able to, irrigate as much as they want? And I think we could ask that about other uses too. With that, this is how you reach me. And I'm not sure if we're going to go to questions or hear from Ryan now.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Stacy, for holding that down. StreamYard crashed my computer 3 minutes before we started. So we're going to do things a little bit out of order, and this is probably going to seem weird, but it's the best we can do, and then we'll do questions. But thank you very much, Stacy and Chloe, for making this happen tonight. Just a quick update of where we are with Florida's drought. I pulled this today. This is the most recent chart from the U.S. Drought conditions. 75% of Florida is currently in drought conditions. It's been that way for most of the summer, and 55% remains in severe or extreme drought conditions. As you can see on the map, those red areas are where the drought is the worst, and you can see clearly we have a good portion of both the Santa Fe and Suwannee River basins in that extreme drought portion. I've been out on those rivers quite a bit over the summer, even after the rains we had recently. And it's really sad. It's you can really begin to see springs die when the flow stops and the algae begins to accumulate. So we're having some real bad impacts. The last webinar, we talked about the impacts to manatees and sturgeon and the effects the drought is having on ecosystems across Florida, but especially in the North Florida area. I know Stacy went over some of this for the the maybe St. John's and Sewanee, but these are the current water shortage restrictions. As Stacy mentioned, both St. John's and Southwest Florida are in phase 3. Sewanee is in phase 2, but those are very similar as to what's entailed in the restrictions. I think that, as Stacy was pointing out, in the Sewanee district, we could probably use more protections right now to try to get ahead of the drought, because we are seeing so many negative impacts. So just to talk really quick, besides the drought, why are flows so low? Stacy mentioned consumptive use permits, but just to dive into those for a minute. For those of you who aren't aware, if you're going to pump more than 100,000 gallons a day in Florida for a consumptive use, you have to get a consumptive or water use permit from one of Florida's 5 water management districts. To obtain a permit, theoretically, an applicant must pass a 3-pronged test that the use is reasonable, beneficial, does not interfere with any existed permitting use, and is in the public interest. Stacy mentioned that I would like to see that language around the public interest strengthened. When you go and you look at the model water code, where our water permitting system comes from, that public interest was really intended to reflect recreational users, our environment, natural systems, the critters, a lot of those things. What we found is that in the implementation of the water management districts, often that public interest is boiled down to a purely economic consideration. So if you think about the Seven Springs water use permit to provide water to Blue Triton, in that situation, the court ruled that the only public interest test was whether or not the water bottler could effectively bottle and sell the water. That clearly doesn't seem like a public interest. That seems like a private interest. And that's one of the main reasons that we're having the issues we are under the drought, is because we haven't kept enough water in the aquifer during the good times to be able to sustain it during the bad times. So ironically, despite the fact that anyone who's seen any of our springs or rivers can tell you that they're suffering extensive harm right now, consumptive use permits are not allowed to cause harm according to rule. And there's a whole list of ways that they are not allowed to cause harm. But despite that, we continue to see harmful water use permits issued, even after MFL recovery strategies have been put into place. So we have this kind of counterintuitive idea that when significant harm is happening, that you can issue a permit that does not cause harm. And what ends up happening is, before significant harm happens, the districts say, well, this individual permit is not that harmful, because they don't really evaluate the permits on a cumulative impact. And then when there's so many of these, death by 1,000 cuts, that the flow gets so low that the minimum flow and level is triggered and significant harm is occurring, they've then added language into the MFL recovery strategies that allows them to continue to issue consumptive use permits even after harm. So we're not doing a good job of preventing the harm before it happens, and we're doing an even worse job of stopping the harm after it's occurred. So I think our legislature recognized this for well more than a decade. I think it's notable that the last time we had a drought was in 2012-13, when the legislature began working on the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. And recognizing that the permitting system was not working, they included a new part of statute, 373.2193, that required the Department of Environmental Protection to adopt uniform rules for issuing permits which prevent harmful groundwater withdrawals. So we went more than 8 years without DEP taking any action to try to pass those rules to strengthen consumptive use permitting rules and to prevent harm. We ended up going to circuit court, filing an amicus brief just to force DEP to propose a rule. Unfortunately, the rule that DEP proposed was identical to the existing rules that have and continue to allow significant harm. We pursued this case through the Division of Administrative Hearings and then through the First District Court of Appeals. And unfortunately, DEP's position is that they do not have to prevent harm, despite the rule and the law, and despite the statute and legislative intent, that the existing rules that we know cause harm can stay in effect, that they don't need to do anything different. Unfortunately, the courts agreed with that. They actually never wrote an opinion, so we're not sure why they ruled on DEP's side. We just know that they did rule on DEP's side, and we're seeing what we're seeing right now in the springs and rivers. That is the ramifications. That is the direct result of 9 years of DEP snubbing the law, not proposing new rules, and then 2 years of fighting environmentalists in court so they can continue to hand out harmful water use permits and drain our springs and rivers. And that's why things look like today. Droughts happen. We can't really do much to affect that. There have always been droughts in Florida. We have not always seen the level of devastation to our ecosystems. And that's a direct result of the failure of DEP and our water management districts and our large water users at enforcing permits and prioritizing conservation. One of the great things about conservation is that if you do it, you can see the impacts immediately, which is very different than the large multi-year, multi-billion advanced wastewater, alternative water supply programs that we see the districts often favoring. So here's a few of the springs that we've been out and visited recently. This is Poe Springs, one of my favorites, where we hold the Santa Fe Spring Celebration. I saw this weekend. It looks like pea soup, which is very, very sad. You can see the run there, what it looked like before and after over at Poe. If we go to Olino State Park, essentially the river rise is dry. We don't see it here, but there's a sign that says no swimming, swift currents, that looks over a bunch of rocks without a drop of water in them, which gives you an idea of what that should look like compared to what it looks like. And finally, one of my favorite springs in Florida, Royal Springs. You can see on the left there, that is what should be the spring run leading out to the Suwannee River. Instead, it is a series of stagnant puddles. So the drought is very real, but it is not the only reason that our springs look like this. A lot of it comes down to our failed regulatory system, and we need to change that, because we will have more droughts, but we don't need to be seeing these kind of impacts. All right, so now we are going to get to questions. All right, and we'll bring Stacy back on. Do we have the questions loaded up, Chloe? All right. If our water level is dropping mostly in the aquifer below the surface, why does the state of Florida continue to allow Nestle Corp to pump out 1 million gallons of water each day? Because they have a consumptive use permit. And if you have a consumptive use permit, you have the right to pump water. And without, meaningful consumptive use permitting rules to prevent permits like this from being issued when we're already seeing significant harm, the folks at Seven Springs are doing nothing wrong. They are pumping entitled to their permit. The real issue is that permit was issued in the first place, in my opinion. Anything you want to add, Stacy?
Yeah, I would just add that, if a water shortage order was taken to the level that, they did add in decreasing of pumping from existing permit, it wouldn't target any specific permit. It really have to be equitable across the board. So, we would potentially see, a reduction from this permit and then, all those others that I showed in that map.
Absolutely. And even if you shut down this one permit altogether, it would do very, very little to fix the overall problem on the Santa Fe River. All right, next question, Chloe. Would transitioning to practices like cover cropping, minimizing tillage, and increasing the diversity of plant life and soil microbial life help increase spring flow? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this question is really talking about agriculture. And, I think if we did, I think soil health, actually, even in our yards too, is super important. And at the county, we're looking at potentially requiring soil amendments for new landscapes so that they won't be using irrigation and fertilizer. So I do think soil health is really key for agriculture and our landscapes across the board. So great point.
Exactly. Yep. I think, anything we can be doing on the ag, as Stacy showed, domestic supply is the single largest in public supply, but especially in the Santa Fe, but also really in the Suwannee, ag is a major, major water user. All right. Next question. What legislation allows permits after MFLs are breached? No legislation allows permits after MFLs are breached. Instead, the water management districts and DEP are Okay, so when you have these MFLs, an MFL is just the amount of water below which significant harm is occurring. And the way that we cure an MFL violation is through a recovery strategy. And recovery and prevention strategies are mentioned in statute, right? You can find those in Chapter 373. The way that the districts implement the recovery strategies is through a regulatory strategy. There is no mention or authorization for regulatory strategies in statute. It's something that it's essentially unadopted rulemaking, where the department and the districts have decided they need these regulatory strategies essentially to be able to continue to hand out water use permits after an MFL has been in violation. So they've created a portion of rule that exists nowhere in statute, which could be ripe for a legal challenge. The problem is that we really want MFLs because they're the only backstop that we have to the problems that we're seeing here. So it is nowhere in statute. It is in rule. And, I think one of the things that if the districts and DEP are going to continue to rely on regulatory strategies, that we need to put them in statute so that there are guardrails for which to follow and so that they're not susceptible to a challenge maybe down the road when a district puts out a really good recovery strategy, and then you see the home builders or some of the industry groups coming after it because they don't have the statutory authorization to do it.
Yeah, and I could add that, it's my understanding when a new permit, comes in right now or an increase in the allocation that, they do look at that. It's a model, and they look at what is the impact to those compliance points. And if there is an impact now, that has to be offset. So that can be offset by, doing a recharge project. It could be offset by buying into some other project. So, offsets are built into it, but it does also rely on that model.
Right. But you could get the water now and do the offset potentially in 20 years.
Yes, some of the timelines.
Which means we may never actually get the offsets, right? The pumping is guaranteed. The offset is completely theoretical at this point for most of it, is my understanding. If we had water first, there would be something to buy into, but I'm not sure what folks are going to buy into now that water first doesn't seem to be happening. Next question. Has anybody ever worked out the cumulative consumptive use of unregulated wells? Stacy.
I love it. So one type of well is your irrigation wells. So this is people that have public supply and then, they don't want to pay that bill. So then they put in an irrigation well. And that one is extra bad because it's not accounted for. Any of those pie charts showing water use, that is not accounted for because we assume that people are just using their public supply and not, double dipping. We have done some exercises and it's really tricky. You would think there's better records of all of the wells, but when we dove into it, it's not the best. And part of the reason is, when someone puts in a well, the well drillers will often mark it as a domestic well, but really it's an irrigation well. But if it meets the qualifications for domestic, as far as setbacks and stuff like that, that's what they do. So then when we go and pull the data, it's hard to find, what are those irrigation wells. But we did do a little exercise and, we definitely found enough that, it was of concern. And, I do think that the districts are trying to get a better handle on that.
Great answer, Stacy. Next question. Pressure washer companies had to the rules and what is considered aesthetics? Have you heard anything on that?
Yeah, another great question. We have pressure washers reach out to us almost every week asking if anything has changed. And I really appreciate their, compliance, that they're paying attention. And, the question about, economic impact, I could say, that this water shortage order is already having an economic impact on, one, our outfitters that are trying to take people out to the springs and they're not flowing, but also businesses like landscaping companies can't really be planting new vegetation right now and the pressure washers. So if we were to take this to the next level and impact all of those permits, I think there's already precedent that we've had some impact on on businesses. So I think there's some gray area about aesthetics, but if you are pressure washing to be preparing for like painting or something like that, or it's safety, like something slippery because there's algae, then that is not aesthetics, and someone is able to then do the pressure washing.
Thank you, Stacy. Next question. Regarding Poe, what is the direct link of Poe to Gainesville?
Yeah, so when we look at the spring sheds as they were mapped a while ago, a lot of the spring sheds, that's the area that contributes flow to Poe Spring, is within Gainesville. So, I do think that the consumptive use permit of GRU, which is the water I'm using at my house and that probably many of us are using, does have an impact on Poe. So I do think, Gainesville is connected there.
Thanks, Stacy. What additional requirements could be petitioned from the water management districts? I guess we can maybe just go back and forth. I think Stacy's already mentioned a few of them. One of is at this point, I think we're at a situation in the drought where there could be mandatory rollbacks across the board to try to, resolve some of the immediate problems. Looking more down the road, you can have reservations where, whether it's a new permit or a renewal, water can be reserved from the system at that point. Certainly much more that can be done with mandatory conservation. As Stacy mentioned, lifting some of the preemptions on local governments. So where water management districts aren't acting, our good local governments can. What else would you add, Stacy?
Yeah, I think one to consider is, those irrigation restrictions, leaving it at once a week year round. There could be some impacts to landscapes, but I would say, if your vegetation can't survive on that once a week, then it's not the right plant for the right place. And the state has really embraced Florida friendly. So, I would say then some people might have to make some changes to their landscapes. But, when you balance it out, I think we all want to have springs, rivers, and a healthy water supply in the future.
Absolutely. Next one. How can we increase water management districts' millage rates so that they have resources to enforce water resource laws? We cannot increase the water management district's millage rates, but the governing board of the water management district certainly can. We've seen some governing boards that have actually wanted to do that in the last few years and have been told not to by the governor's office. So hopefully, as we get new leadership in Tallahassee, hopefully new leadership at the water management districts, new leadership at DEP, we can begin to see governing boards that are willing to increase the millage rate. I will say that if you're concerned about the water management district millage rate, Amendment 3 on the November ballot is very important because while a lot of the focus there goes towards local governments, water management districts are among the entities that are included in the amendment. And if you think things are bad now, which they are, wait until the districts are completely reliant on Tallahassee for all of their funding. I think from an environmental perspective, that would be very, very bad, and also potentially leads to the elimination of all property taxes. And our water management districts, although I'm very critical of their job recently, from an institutional perspective, they're some of the best institutions in the state, right? If you look at how to manage resources, these were set up based on really good research and academics by very smart people. And if we had governing boards that, like the statute says, that were diverse and had diversity of interest, diversity of professions, diversity of expertise, like we did in the 80s and 90s, I think we would see, higher millage rates and better decisions all around. Anything you want to add, Stacy?
Yeah, it's a really insightful question. I think we have a lot of really great and talented staff at our water management districts, but they're definitely strapped thin. Like getting out and doing enforcement, they just don't have those resources to do it.
Right, and the staff has nothing to do with the millage rate. So the staff, yeah. I'm sure every single person at the staff would love to have more money to do their jobs. That is a decision completely coming down from the governing board and the governor's office. It's a good point, Stacy. Next question. Do all the water managers just get together, or is it another level of one hand not talking to the other? Oh, no, they definitely get together. And more than that, they just do what DEP says. So it's really 5 fingers being controlled by one hand.
And I'll add to that too, like the North Florida Regional Water Supply Plan that I showed, and this MFL for the Santa Fe and Ichetucknee has been very much St. John's and Sewanee working together. So really recognizing that the water doesn't follow the political boundaries that, you know, we all recognize. So I know those districts are working together. You know, I wish there's a little more coordination on the water shortage, because as someone that has to enforce it for a county that's split between the two, I think we've done a good job of communicating to them some of the issues, and they've been trying to fix them. So now it's a little bit more seamless in our county.
That's great. And when you think about the, you know, the water supply plans and MFLs, the water management districts were told by the legislature that, you know, when you have a system that is in 2 different districts, it goes to DEP. So I think, you know, DEP is kind of allowing that collaboration to happen by having a central hub where those plans are developed. Next question. All right. I've written op-eds with economic scenarios sure to slow extraction, but it seems people would rather go for desalination and let ag die rather than pay anything. How can this attitude be modified? I don't know. I think on an individual level, there's a lot of evidence that Floridians are more than happy to pay for conservation. You know, anytime a conservation land initiative is on a local ballot, no matter how liberal or conservative the county or municipality, that they always overwhelmingly pass. You know, I think it's more of an issue at the lobbyist level, the Association of Industries of Florida, Chamber of Commerce, you know, at the industry level. And I don't know how you convince, you know, businesses that are built to make a profit, especially when they have to compete with other areas that don't have the environmental resources to protect that Florida does, that they should be, you know, paying more. I think that's why we have laws, and what we need is for the legislature to step up. I mean, we've had multiple studies on water use fees. I still think water use fees would be the silver bullet to, you know, moving water towards conservation and to higher value uses. That so far has, you know, been recommended from Florida for decades, but has not been something that the legislature has had the willingness to take on. Even just a few years ago, there was a water bottling study that looked at water use fees. So, you know, maybe it's time for us to bring that conversation back.
Yeah, and I think what this question is getting at, and what you're talking about, Ryan, is right, like you pay per gallon. So even all those domestic self-supply wells and the businesses and the ag, you know, so paying for it. We do know that pricing works in public supply. You know, GRU has great data that shows, you know, as they did tiered rates, you always want that, we call it life water. So that low tier to be very affordable so that everyone can afford water for cooking, cleaning, bathing. And then once you get into that discretionary, so someone is irrigating and using a lot of water, you want it to be more expensive to have that price pressure. And it works extremely well. You know, if you see the use go down when people start to get into those tiers. I mean, right now the crux there of why that we can't use that as effectively is because then you do see people put in those irrigation wells, and we don't want that to happen. So once we close that loophole, I think that we could see utilities do better with water pricing, but that still doesn't get at the bigger picture of all those other permits.
Right, which is, you know, I think where we need to try to do. I mean, especially, you know, maybe we may not need to have a water use fee on every single consumptive use permit, but, you know, I think when you look at some uses like water bottling, that have, you know, such a high profit margin, and because they're extracted right from the springs, you know, an oversized effect, a water use fee that then goes back into restoring the resources, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, you'd have to. We've looked a lot at this. It'd have to be very tiered. You can't charge a water bottler the same thing as ag. You know, ag may even need to be exempt from such a situation. But we have to find a way to start making conservation the economic choice. right? I mean, that's when we'll begin to see, without having to have a ton of regulation or spending a bunch of money, when large water users see putting in innovative conservation technology is cheaper, right, than paying for the water. I think that's when we'll begin to see the market influences actually have a benefit. Any more questions, Chloe? Everyone for being here. This webinar will be up tomorrow morning on YouTube. Thank you everyone for bearing with us. I want to give a big thank you to Stacey Greco for being here and bearing with us, and for all the amazing things that she does for Alachua County and the springs and rivers that I love. Always great to see you, Stacey. And please share the webinar. Also, we are bringing on a new attorney at the Florida Springs Council. Very excited about this. This has been something one of my goals since I took over FSC was to have a full-time attorney to be able to help rural communities fight for springs and rivers, work with the DEP and the districts and local governments. So you can support that effort right now. We already have 2-year fellowship, and we're looking to make that a permanent position. So the Springs will always have a good lawyer fighting for them. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you again next month.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Stacey. Bye-bye.